Hey everyone. A lot of people have been asking me today, how do the election results impact our access to legal name change, legal gender marker change, and same-sex marriage protections? And I wanted to take some time to address those issues one by one, because I know there's a lot of misinformation going on out there, and there's a lot of gaps. My name's Keith Rose. I use he and they pronouns, and I'm a paralegal, not an attorney. I help run the St. Louis Name and Gender Marker Change Mutual Aid Group, and I also used to be the Director of LGBTQ Initiatives at the Metro St. Louis Equal Housing and Opportunity Council. So I have some experience with queer and trans discrimination cases, and I've also worked on maybe about 500 people's legal name changes, more than 100 gender marker changes, and I've been doing this work even under the first Trump administration. So I do have some experience on what's going on. And one of the first things I want to say is, although there is a tendency to doom spiral, to think that all is lost, to think that all transition access will immediately go away on January 20th, I want to say that that's not true. That's not how laws work. That's not a practical understanding of what we're looking at. And so I think it'd be really helpful for us to ground ourselves in the reality of the situation that we're facing. So while we don't want to be underprepared, while we still can get prepared, it is also important to understand that misinformation and panic might lead us to making bad decisions or being rushed into situations that are not the best outcome. So we know that there are many horrific ways that the far-right authoritarian trajectory can harm our community. So let's talk about at least what I think from my years in the legal field, but also as a political strategist with the queer community, thinking about what we're actually facing on the ground. So first, I think it's really important for us to look at same-sex marriage, partially because it's an easier and more uniform than name and gender marker change access. So I'm going to go with that. The first thing I want to say is that right now there are some things that are not our priorities. For example, I'm seeing a lot of people say that their first step is to become officiants so that they can officiate same-sex weddings in the next couple of months. I want to say that I don't think that that is a priority right now. That's not something that there is really a big gap in services for. There are other ways you can spend your time, and sometimes it does feel like those folks are just trying to become maybe the main character in someone else's oppression, and that's not the right way to approach these things. There are other gaps that we can be filling, and you rushing out and making sure that you can perform a wedding is not going to save anyone. I promise you that. But there are many other things that we can do, and especially when talking about name and gender marker change access, which I'm going to talk about in a future video. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that it is extremely unlikely that same-sex marriage, as it exists today, is going to end up being banned outright, at least for the foreseeable future. I'm talking within the next 4 to 5 years. I also don't think that current same-sex marriages are going to be annulled or divorced en masse. That is a very, very unlikely outcome. What's more likely to happen is that, given the makeup of the U.S. Supreme Court, many state Supreme Courts, the U.S. presidency, Senate and House, and also many state legislatures, we're going to see an increase in tolerance for discrimination against same-sex couples and their families. So what does that look like on the ground? It might look like individual government officials and even random employees of government offices who refuse to perform same-sex marriages or even process our paperwork. You might remember when we were getting expanded marriage access about a decade ago. This was something we saw in some counties. I would anticipate things like that having an uptick and people claiming religious freedom and religious exemptions for their job, and that being more tolerated. And so there is a good chance that our access to marriage and marriage benefits is going to be challenged, but maybe not the ability to have marriage per se. Also, I think that what we're going to see is the courts, as well as the federal and state legislatures, are going to continue to make it easier for employers to opt out of treating our marriages equally to straight marriages. That might look like they would deny your family leave. It might be something like your spouse is being denied benefit coverage. That's a reality. So we're going to have to continue outside of the legal and legislative avenues to put pressure on corporations and employers to make sure that they are still offering these benefits. That's something that we can work on, and that's really a place to grow. Even without having to change politicians, we can still change the policies of our employers most of the time. So another thing that I think we're going to see is most anti-LGBTQ discrimination will not be punished federally. So I anticipate that by the middle of 2025, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the U.S. Department of Justice will no longer be taking any of the most egregious anti-LGBTQ discrimination cases. I anticipate that they will quietly close out their existing cases as well. And that really saddens me because I've personally spent so much of my own time over the last couple of years trying to get them to take on more anti-LGBT discrimination cases. So seeing them move away from that is going to be really frustrating for me and some of my clients. And I would anticipate that the knock-on effect of that is that there will be more of a tolerance for discrimination. I think that over the next 2 years, official government anti-discrimination training and outreach materials will quietly be rewritten to remove references to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We've been getting those two terms put into federal anti-discrimination training materials over the last 3 or so years, and I think that it's soon going to be going away. And what that looks like on the ground is you see one of those signs in your employment, where they say, we're not allowed to discriminate based on X, Y, Z. I think they quietly remove sexual orientation and gender identity. I think what it looks like is staff at these enforcement agencies will not be told about those protected classes, which generally are considered a subcategory of sex discrimination as of today. And so what's going to look like is that whenever we're passing out cards to random people on the street saying, hey, these are your protected classes, we are going to be erased. And so because of that, there will be less of an awareness for protections for sexual orientation and gender identity, and that's going to lead to less people looking out for that kind of discrimination and less people avoiding doing discriminatory behavior because they might not even realize that we are a protected class as of today. So another thing that I think is going to happen is as a result of the lack of enforcement, people and corporations will become more emboldened to discriminate against us. I think that some landlords might no longer feel obligated to rent to same-sex couples and queer people. Not immediately, but over time. This is a slow trickle of discrimination, not something that happens in January, not something that happens in June. This is something that our cultural shift will make it more of a tolerant place for discrimination, at least more of a place than it's been for the last 3 or so years. I think that this might look like some realtors might no longer feel obligated to show houses to same-sex couples and queer couples. I think that some shelter providers might no longer consider same-sex couples to be a family unit. Of course, to be clear, this discrimination already occurs very frequently. I myself wrote a big report about it for my job last year. I'm just saying that would-be discriminatory housing and service providers will no longer be afraid of federal discrimination lawsuits, especially if they decide to cite a religious exemption. In a state like Missouri, where I am, we also have a Missouri agency that is supposed to fight against discrimination. They have for years not cared about the LGBT community, and so they've never been a threat to would-be discriminators. If you live in a state or want to move to a state that does take discrimination seriously, it is possible that there will be less discrimination because of the enforcement, but it's also possible that the U.S. Supreme Court will try to prevent state agencies from exercising protections against discrimination for queer and trans community members in the same ways that they have attacked Colorado's over the years, especially for people who are citing religious exemptions. So be aware of that. But again, these aren't things that happen overnight. They're slow trickles. Even under the kind of authoritarian regime that Donald Trump is going to bring in, we should not expect that one day your rights are just gone. It's something that happens case by case, interaction by interaction. Things become more hostile. I'm really confident that one day I'm not going to wake up and my marriage is annulled, and the same for yours. But it is going to be the case that if someone says that my husband and I can't do something, I will have fewer legal options to force them to treat us like straight couples, if that makes sense. And so I want to talk a little bit about adoption agencies and foster programs, which is something that I do not have much experience with, I will say. But I do think that we will quickly see further protections for adoption agencies and foster programs that refuse to work with same-sex couples. If you have already been thinking seriously about adopting or fostering, you might want to look into what options you have now and consider going forward with that while you can, if it makes most sense for you, for the kids, for your family. I don't think that the options we currently have will suddenly go away next year. I think it's more likely it will be a series of changes that raise the bar and force same-sex couples to jump through ever more difficult hoops than straight couples. I also think that even in adjacent states or adjacent counties, there might be drastically different hurdles for same-sex couples than straight couples. And so you might want to adopt, if you might want to adopt, and you're thinking about moving in the coming months or years, that might be something to consider, how favorable that geographic location is to same-sex adoption and what you predict they will be doing to protect you and your family's right to raise a child in the coming years. Another issue I want to talk about is how can you protect your spouse, protect your marriage? Really important thing that you should be doing, whether or not you have a same-sex marriage, but especially if you have a same-sex marriage, is to make sure that you have correct beneficiary designations on all of your property and accounts. You should make sure that they are updated, make sure that they are recorded, and make sure that they are organized and accessible in a safe place. So beneficiary designations can be things like a form that you fill out at your credit union that says, if I die or if I am no longer able to make decisions for myself, maybe you're in a coma, maybe you had dementia, then this person who I've designated is the person who will be taking over control of this. So we're going to be talking about our beneficiary designations. We're going to be talking about also getting things in place to make sure that all of our documentation is in order, because it might be the case that one random bigot at a hospital refuses to recognize that this person is your wife, even if she is. And we saw that for generations, especially during the AIDS epidemic. And so it's something that our community knows how to deal with. And we've done it before and we will do it again. So I'm encouraging you, if you own real estate, to talk to attorneys about beneficiary deeds, look at transfer on death instruments, put together a durable power of attorney for healthcare, put together a durable power of attorney for your finances. So that's who's making the decisions, like I said, if you can no longer make decisions for yourself. We're talking about wills, maybe trusts. We're talking about a HIPAA authorization where you say who has access to your medical records. And that's very important for someone who has chosen family. We're talking about having a health care directive. That is something where you are singling out what kind of treatment you want at end of life. It really helps your loved ones so that they know what your wishes are. And we're going to be doing that with our families, talking it through. We're going to make sure that they are properly notarized and copied. We're going to have those accessible. These are the kind of things that all marriages should have in place, but same-sex marriages these days definitely need. Let's also think a little bit about polyamorous relationships. I think that if you are in a polyamorous relationship and you want your estate plans to reflect multiple partners simultaneously, I really suggest that you schedule a consultation with an attorney, maybe one who has experience with queer relationships, and go over your options. Based on my experience, I would expect an attorney representing you and your partners for estate planning in a poly relationship might cost $1,000 to $3,000 to get your information in place. And that's because our system really wasn't set up for people who have multiple designated partners to have benefits. So that's something else to consider. While we're talking about beneficiaries, you really should be contacting your job if you feel safe doing that and telling them, make sure you have on record, this is my spouse. Make sure that your all of your benefits, are transferred to your spouse if that's available. Have all of those things not only in writing, but up to date, because it might become even harder to change things, even if they don't just go away. There might be stricter scrutiny in the future of our relationships. And so the more we can have in place and settled now, the better it will be. So I'm going to talk maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, about name changes and how those might be impacted by the election results. But just a teaser, really important things to know is you change your name based on the county and state that you currently live in, regardless of where you were born. And you change the gender on your birth certificate based upon the state that you were born in, regardless of where you live today. And that's very important when talking about how we're going to address these problems. So again, my name is Keith. I'm with the St. Louis Name Change Mutual Aid. I'm not a lawyer. This is just how I think things are going to be going over the next few years. I really encourage you to sit down with your partner, if you have one, and talk through these things. If you're not married, I do not think you need to rush to get married if you are not already planning on being married in the next few months, with one exception. If you and your partner are of different nationalities and you are going to be using your marriage to confer upon your partner benefits, for example, if you are marrying someone who is foreign-born and not a U.S. citizen, and they are going to use your marriage to adjust their status and maybe get a green card, I would highly recommend you do that shit yesterday. So right now, Donald Trump has made promises that he is going to break our immigration system, and I fully believe it because he has done it before. I would say that if you can, please, if you need to, submit documentation to change your partner's status or change your own status, have your partner sponsor you as soon as possible. Get that into USCIS and hope that it progresses along before Donald Trump changes things.